Okay, we can begin by saying that in the second part of the essay, Modern Fiction, Virginia Woolf uh, reinforces her argument. In the first part of the essay, she made a case for reinventing the novel, mainly because the most popular form of novel writing, which is the novel of realism or the realist novel, has failed to realize the possibilities of the art due to several reasons. She took up three writers, H.G. Wells, Arnold Bennett, and John Galsworthy, to in order to uh, bring before us the fact that these writers who write social novels, novels of social realism, suffer from some inadequacies, which she describes as their failure to capture life, to capture the real meaning of life. Therefore, she says that these three writers are such models that are not they cannot be treated as perfect models of novelists, and there is a need to reinvent the art of novel writing. She is very specific about certain uh, problems which creep into the realist form of novel writing, uh, because of certain larger assumptions which are there in the backdrop of this kind of novel. These assumptions are, she has already stated these very clearly in the first part of the essay. These assumptions are, number one, that the realist novel presents life in an idealized form. It presents life as something that is coherent and organized. Linked with this is the larger assumption that these novelists tend to take a teleological view of life. By teleological view of life, we mean that they treat life as something that has a preordained grand plan according to which the destiny of human beings take them from from imperfect ways of life to more refined and perfect ways of life. Secondly, these novels look at life as purposeful, meaningful, and as uh, something which has a larger design, which is not, I mean to say, they do not see life as either absurd, pointless, or meaningless. They treat life as purposeful. Lastly, these writers take a universalist view of life. This is another assumption which remains in the backdrop of a novel of social realism. Uh, they take a universalist view of life under which it is believed that human beings share the same life, share the same destiny. So if you talk about one person, you are talking about everyone else. The characters are less individuals and more types. Linked with this is a very important fact that individuals in this kind of novel are shown performing social roles. They are shown in the socio cultural context of life, living and leading a social life as social beings. Now, this kind of an approach to novel writing is contested in the second half of the essay through two statements. I will quote. Number one, examine for a moment an ordinary mind on an ordinary day. The mind receives a myriad impressions. trivial, fantastic, evanescent, or engraved with the sharpness of steel. So she says that life is much more complex than these writers would have us believe. When the focus is exclusively on the social life of individuals, the psychological life, the subtleties of psychological life, the susceptibilities of psychological life, the impulses, the tensions and confusions, which are equally true to the life of every individual, get get ignored. They are very conveniently ignored. They are not. They do not form the subject uh, of the fiction. So here we can say that Virginia Woolf not only makes a case for the reinvention of novel, she says that it is very important for novelists to pay attention to the psychological aspects of life, to the aspects related with the consciousness of individuals, to the complexities, the intricacies, confusions, uncertainties, subtleties, susceptibilities, impulses of human life, which is best expressed through the statement I have just read out for you. The statement is: examine for a moment an ordinary mind and on an ordinary day. The mind receives a myriad impressions. So this is a clue that she is making a case for a new kind of novel, which would be not only innovative in its form, but also will make human consciousness the subject of the text. So, the second thing which is related with this is that she makes a case for a rejection of realism, rejection of realist art, and and innovation at formal. Realist form has to be now given up, and formal experimentation with the works of art, with novel, has is very important, because the new novel, the novel of the modern writers, rather than paying attention and focusing on the social life of individuals, needs to focus, in order to capture life, as she time and again says, in order to capture life, uh, it needs to take up a new subject, select a new subject, and the subject is human consciousness and human psychology. So a psychoanalytical approach to novel writing can take place only through formal innovation, new form of writing. So here we can take up the second oft-quoted statement in the essay, where she says, I quote, life is not a series of gig lamps symmetrically arranged. Life is a luminous halo, semi-transparent envelope surrounding us from the beginning of consciousness to the end. So human consciousness is subject to lots and lots of uh, you know uh, confusions, like there is fear of death, there are libidinal urges, there are insecurities, uncertainties, the feeling of alienation. These all are uh, are present in human consciousness, and she makes a case for a novel which would make human consciousness its subject through experimentation in form. Here, at this stage in the essay, she makes a mention of a new writer. The writer is James Joyce. And she says that James Joyce, through a new approach to novel writing, is uh, is uh, is making novel writing much more meaningful. So I'm quoting from the text. It is, at any rate, in some such fashion as this that we seek to define the quality which distinguishes the work of several young writers, among them Mr. James Joyce. Uh, they attempt to come closer to life and to preserve more sincerely and exactly what interests and moves them. Then, after a few lines, let us not take it for granted that life exists more fully in what is commonly thought big than in what is commonly thought small. So, in mentioning James Joyce, she is supporting the idea of a new kind of art which which is more close to life because of three or four things. Now, there are three or four merits she finds in Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce or his second work, Ulysses. She says that in these works, now, here it is important to mention that just as she reserved the term materialists for the three writers in the first part, in the second part, she addresses James Joyce as spiritual. She says if H.G. Wells, Arnold Bennett, and Galsworthy were materialists, James Joyce is spiritual. Why is he spiritual? She reserves the label spiritual for James Joyce as, according to her, he records the impressions of daily life in a very faithful way. Secondly, James Joyce has the audacity to challenge and subvert the conventions of a realist novel. According to her, any conscientious writer who wants to exploit the art of novel writing fully would need to subvert, challenge, and reject the conventions of realist novel. So she, and thereafter, she says that James Joyce is, let me, yes, uh, yes, she says that James Joyce, by experimenting with the form of the novel, by choosing a new subject for his novels, is giving is choosing to give up two things which are deeply characteristic of the traditional novel, and they are probability and coherence. Yes. So thereafter, she says that, however, even though James Joyce is writing very powerful works of fiction, he is still being denied the the uh, he's still not being considered great. He's still being denied greatness. Why is this so? Now she says there are three or four charges which are brought against uh, James Joyce, and which are being used to say that James Joyce is not as great a writer as, let's say, Hardy or Conrad. Now, what are these charges? Number one, that he lacks magnitude and breadth, that he does not have, his works do not have sufficient scope to give us a vision of life. Secondly, his works do not deal with the whole of humanity. The novels that he writes are, are limited in scope. It is not, these are not novels where the writer has the entire vista of human life before him. It is as if the novelist confines himself in a small room and writes from a closed space. So then the next charge, which is commonly brought against James Joyce, is that he sometimes takes up such topics which are socially not, which are considered to be indecent, or which do not have social approval. So, but because when you plumb the depths of human psychology, you are likely to stumble on stuff which is related with the deeper urges of human beings. So in that sense, she says that there are many things which are subjected to the charge of impropriety in the novels of James Joyce. So these are 3 or 4 merits and 3 or 4 charges which he feels are brought against James Joyce by critics and writers. Now, it is important for us that we have some clarity about the new kind of novel being what stream of consciousness novel written by James Joyce is a new kind of fiction, and it is important for us to have some idea about the stream of consciousness technique of novel writing. Now, stream of consciousness technique is defined by a text. It is a kind of text where there is an unbroken flow of perceptions, thoughts, feelings, and taking place in the mind of an individual. So, as I have said, this novel focuses on human psychology, human consciousness, rather than the social world. Then we can also say that this novel, stream of consciousness novel, records the feelings and thoughts as they impinge on human consciousness. So then there is the narrator's intervention. In the realist novel, you have an omniscient author or narrator who seems to know each and everything that is taking place in the plot. In this novel, the narrator's intervention is absent, which means the author does not intervene, does not step inside the text and comment on the action which is taking place in the text. Thereafter, the thoughts, memories, feelings, random associations of the characters form the subject matter of the text. It is through the stream of consciousness, the continuous thoughts of the characters, that the reader forms an idea about the life and the character, the background of, we can take the example of Mrs. Dalloway, which is a novel of one day. The story is limited to a day, and we are shown Mrs. Dalloway making preparations for a party. And it is in the course of her thoughts, her memories, her her stream of consciousness, that we understand the life of Mrs. Dalloway. So we can say that this new kind of fiction being written by George James Joyce and Virginia Woolf herself is characterized by three or four things. Number one, such a fiction which is a record of unbroken flow of perceptions, thoughts, feelings in a working mind would definitely not have a plot. So it doesn't have a plot, a conventional plot where you have a beginning, middle, and end. Then a text which doesn't have a plot would not be linear. These kind of texts are called non-linear texts because here you have an interplay of past, present, interplay of time. So there is the events and the episodes are not arranged in a logical manner or in a causal sequence where one thing leads to the other. So if we say the same thing in simple English, we would say that they do not have a beginning, a middle, or an end. So, and then taking our clue from the statement which I read from the text, these novels tend to be impressionistic. They are they try to capture the impressions received or the reception of the impressions in the mind of the characters rather than an objective view of the social life of the characters. Thereafter, these novels, as far as their technique is concerned, use or employ what has been described as multiple focalization. In the traditional novel, in the realist novel, we have the single perspective of the omniscient author who seems to control the life of all the characters as if they are puppets. Now, this novel is different because this uses or employs the technique of multiple focalization. Rather than giving you one perspective, the novel may give you more than one perspective from which you can see, you can understand the story. So with this, we can conclude this lecture, and I will briefly perform a recapitulation of the main points that we have discussed here. Number one, we begin by saying that Virginia Woolf makes a case of reinvention of the novel because the realist novel has failed to realize the possibilities of novel writing. Secondly, she disagrees with the larger assumptions which stay in the backdrop of realist novel, like the assumption that life is meaningful. Secondly, she does not take a teleological view of life, where life is understood to be to have a preordained purpose. Human beings are thought to have a preordained destiny. She does not, thereafter, she does not agree with the universalist assumptions that human beings share the same life. She feels that there is need for formal innovation as well as innovations related to subject matter. At the formal level, she believes that the stream of consciousness novel being written by James Joyce can be a very good model of the modernist novel. At the level of the subject matter, she believes that now, rather than showing human beings in the social context, leading their social lives, it is important to focus on human psychology, human consciousness, the urges, susceptibilities, the uncertainties, the insecurities which occupy human consciousness. Then, in the next part, there are merits of James Joyce, which are discussed. The merits include his defiance, his rejection and subversion of conventions of realism, and his ability to capture life more closely. Uh, in the merits, she also, while discussing the merits of James Joyce, she calls him a spiritual writer rather, in contrast to the materialist. As far as the charges brought against James Joyce are concerned, she says that writers and critics believe that he lacks a vision of life. His novels lack magnitude and breadth, and sometimes there is the charge of indecency is also brought in, because he tends to deal with such subjects which do not have social approval. He goes deep into the consciousness of the characters, and sometimes takes up subjects which are socially not proper, which are considered to be socially improper. And lastly, we noted down the main features of the novel of Stream of Consciousness. Number one, they do not have a plot. Number two, they are non-linear texts. There is an interplay of present and past. They do not follow a causal and a logical sequence of events. They are impressionistic. They are based on the impressions received by the characters, and there is the technique of multiple focalization. So with this, we end our lecture today, and we will have a uh, journal